Some people are like, why is there so much attention being focused on the Alberta climate policy? And I want to give some context to that. So globally, Canada only contributes 1.6% of the global emissions, greenhouse gas emissions that we're trying to reduce. Only 1.6. And there's a lot of people that are like, why is everyone looking at Canada? Why should we care? It's only 1.6% of the global emissions. But when you look at the per capita emissions, so how much we create as a country with not a high population, we're creating actually a lot of emissions. Our global emissions per capita, or the global per capita average per person on the planet is only 4.6 metric tons of emissions per person. In Canada, our emissions are at about 16.3 tons. So that's 3 times the global emissions. So we're creating 3 times per person the global emissions of the rest of the world. And then if you look at Alberta, and you come to Alberta, it's actually even higher than that. The Alberta emissions, I believe, we're 66 metric tons per person. So that's 13.4 times higher than the global average. So Alberta has and then let's look at the context of Alberta's contributions to Canada. We contribute right now about 40% of the overall emissions for the entire country come from just Alberta. So when Canada starts talking about creating climate change policy, they're going to look to this province because we have to significantly reduce emissions in this province in order for Canada to meet any kind of global commitments that were made in places like Paris or by the federal government. So let's come back to where does that leave Indigenous peoples? Mike talked about a consultation process. Well, government has backtracked on using the word consultation since there's been some heavy criticism, and they refer to the meetings that took place with those 47 participants as discussions. They're no longer consultation, they were only discussions. And that they have not engaged in a consultation process with First Nations at all on climate change. And that they're not really sure how to do that yet. I've been in direct contact with ministers of environment, with Andrew Leach, who sat at the table, to try and find a way for them to address this. My recommendation to them was that they do not launch a plan until they have done proper consultation, and they said, but we need a plan before we go to Paris. And I was like, so you're just going to just bypass consultation and your fiduciary obligation to do so to launch this? And they're like, what are we supposed to do? And I'm like, not launch a plan without First Nations consultation? But that didn't happen. And the one thing that the government has said, and this gives us a window of opportunity, is this is not a concrete policy. This is a work plan. And so that creates an opportunity for us as Indigenous people to create our own set of demands to government. And this is the same thing at the federal level. There is no climate policy developed. And so therefore there's this great opportunity for us as Indigenous people to find ways to ensure that our rights are included. One of the things that Andrew Leach and some of the representatives of the government stated were some of their challenges to engaging First Nations and Métis communities in these conversations was that most of our communities were not equipped with technical representatives to talk about climate change. My response back to them is, it's because you're speaking a different language. We might be speaking English, but there are not even words in our language for climate change. So how can you ask our people about climate change if you're not even speaking our language? And I'm like, you need to engage in a process with trying to understand what climate change means to Indigenous communities and then start to work from there. And you also need to ensure that there are resources provided to communities to ensure that they have adequate staff and time to develop their own climate change positions and policies. And so we have a lot of challenges with trying to become engaged, but I feel like even though we might not be talking about developing climate change in our policies in our communities, we have all been talking about climate change for decades. All of our people have been talking about the things that we are seeing in the changes to the land. And we've been told by government that we have to articulate those things within a small window when we're talking about impacts to resource development. But those impacts from resource development are being magnified and amplified, exacerbated by climate change. Those same projects that are creating emissions like oil, fracking, even the logging, which is taking away carbon sinks, and that's where the trees naturally store all that carbon. That is all a process that is contributing to that 66 metric tons per person that we're creating in Alberta, or the 3.4 times higher that we're creating as across the country. And so we are seeing and we are feeling the first impacts of climate change, yet as government is preparing climate change policies, they don't know how to talk to us about climate change because they see it as numbers and metrics, and they're trying to quantify it with dollars and carbon tax. And we have to find a way to ensure that our rights are not left at the sidelines like they were in Paris. The reason we showed that video is to show that this struggle of the inclusion of Indigenous rights is happening at every level of government. And it's time for our people to educate ourselves on what is happening in policy development so that we don't get left behind for two reasons. One, this is about commodifying carbon. Carbon pricing is about commodifying the air. And that carbon tax, the word tax, do we pay taxes on our reserves? No. So how are they going to implement a market-wide carbon tax in First Nations communities? Do we challenge that? I don't know. Like, these are questions we don't have answers to. How do we benefit from that carbon tax? How are we going to access it? How is the government going to trickle that down? As far as royalties go, anywhere across the country, have we ever directly benefited from any other resources? No. We have to negotiate through impact benefit agreements in order to get any kind of deal from the resources that are being extracted from our provinces, either through contracts and business agreements or impact benefit agreements. So how are we going to ensure that we benefit from this new carbon tax? How are we going to ensure that we don't have to pay for this carbon tax? Because another thing is we are the least to contribute to climate change. We are the first to feel the impacts of climate change. There is an irony to that, and therefore we should not have to pay into that carbon levy, and that the big polluters should be paying the most, and there has to be mechanisms implemented into any policy to ensure that we are benefiting from this and that our rights are included and protected. And so I really want to end with that and be quick with that, and we have to find ways to come together to educate our communities. And so I just want to say one more thing, is that this meeting, we want to understand what climate change means to you in your breakout sessions. What do you think we need to do to ensure that we're part of those conversations that Mike talked about? And how do we develop our own solutions using our rights as Indigenous people, our sovereignty as Indigenous people, to ensure we are not left on the sidelines? Because as we see the renewable energy boom be created, we're going to be left on the sidelines trying to get impact benefit agreements with those same companies, just like we do with any oil and gas or logging or any other industry. And that should not be the case. We cannot be on the sidelines of economic development. We can't be economic hostages to any kind of economic and energy paradigms that are being created in the wake of trying to address climate change. So I implore you all to really participate and give those ideas over the next 2 days. So masicho.